Today, we're jumping back in time, way back, over 4,000 years ago, to a place called ancient Sumer. And we're going to uncover a surprising truth. In one of the world's very first civilizations, women had way more power and influence than you might think.
I mean, think about it for a second. When you hear the ancient world, what's the first image that pops into your head?
Yeah, chances are you're picturing kings, male warriors, and societies where men pretty much called all the shots. That's the story we get from a lot of movies and books, right?
But what if I told you that in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, one of the earliest civilizations on Earth, tells a much more complicated and honestly a way more interesting story about the role of women? All right, let's dive right in. The position of women in ancient Sumer was, frankly, unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient world. It really makes you rethink a lot of what we assume about the past.
So, where do we start? Well, a lot of the time, power comes down to money and the law. And it turns out Sumerian women were major players in the economy.
Some of these rights are going to sound surprisingly modern. We know from their ancient law codes, which were like the first ever rule books for society, that women could own their own land. They could go to court to represent themselves. They could inherit wealth. And they could even sign business contracts. This was a huge deal for the time.
A big part of this financial power came from something called a dowry. That's the property or money a woman brought with her when she got married. Now here's the crucial part. In Sumer, she often kept personal control over it. It was hers. That meant she had her own financial safety net, which gave her a real measure of independence.
So, with rights like these, women weren't just stuck at home. They were out there, active in the world, and they were absolutely essential to how their cities worked.
And they held some really important jobs. They were weavers, making textiles that were a huge part of trade. They were bakers, feeding the cities. And get this, they were professional brewers. Beer was a staple of the Sumerian diet, so being a brewer was a really vital and respected job.
And this wasn't just volunteer work. They were paid for what they did, usually in grain or silver, which were the standard currencies back then. This gave them real economic clout.
Now, in family life, marriage was usually a formal contract, an arrangement between two families. Once married, a woman became the mistress of the household. She was in charge of managing everything at home and raising the kids, which was seen as a super important and respected role in their society.
But women's influence didn't stop with business and law. Not even close. They also held incredible power in the worlds of religion and culture.
The absolute top religious job a woman could have was called an end priestess. And this wasn't just a title. These women, who were often the king's own daughters, managed gigantic temple estates with tons of land and thousands of workers. They were basically powerful CEOs.
But among all these powerful women, one stands out. She took that power to a whole other level.
Her name was Enheduanna, and her legacy is just mind-blowing. She is the very first author. Not just female author, but any author in all of recorded history whose name we know is attached to their work. Just let that sink in for a second.
And Enheduanna wasn't just some poet hiding away. As a high priestess and a king's daughter, she was a major political player. The hymns she wrote actually helped to spiritually unite the different cities of the empire, so she was a political force and a literary genius.
Now we have to be real here. And Enheduanna was exceptional. Formal schools were mostly for boys trying to become scribes, but girls from elite families, especially princesses, were often taught to read and write so they could manage households or temples. So while it was definitely rare, literate women were a real thing.
But this brings us to a really important point. While women had all these opportunities, life in Sumer wasn't the same for everybody. It was a society that was all about social class.
A woman's reality depended entirely on where she stood on the social ladder. If you were a royal woman, you lived a life of luxury and influence. If you were a common woman, you worked hard every day in the fields or workshop. And at the very bottom, enslaved women did the absolute hardest physical labor. And you could often see this status just by looking at someone. Women used fashion to show who they were. The quality of their clothes, these fringed garments called kaunakis, along with their jewelry and makeup, all sent a clear signal about their wealth and place in society. You know, this recognition of female power went all the way to the top. It was baked right into their religion. The Sumerian gods included some incredibly powerful goddesses, like Inanna. She was the goddess of love and war, and she was seen as fierce, independent, and powerful enough to challenge anyone.
So when you put all of these pieces together, the picture you get isn't some simple male-dominated world. It's a deeply complex society where women could be brewers, landowners, political leaders, and even the world's first ever author. Okay, let's do a quick recap. What are the big takeaways? In ancient Sumer, women had real, legal, and economic rights. They held powerful roles in religion and politics. The world's first known author was a woman named Enheduanna. And, crucially, a woman's everyday life was completely shaped by her social class.
And all of this leaves us with one last big question to think about. If a civilization from over 4,000 years ago had such complex and powerful roles for women, what does that say about our own modern ideas of history and the long, winding road we call progress?